Picture this, a structure so immense, so perfectly aligned with the stars, that it has captured human imagination for thousands of years, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Even today, with all our modern technology, building something like it would be a monumental challenge. So how did ancient Egyptians manage it? For generations, we've been told wild theories about alien intervention or lost super sciences stories that take away from the real, breathtaking human achievement right in front of us. But what if the real story is even more incredible? What if the truth isn't about mysterious forces, but about ordinary people doing extraordinary things? Today, we're digging into the real labor behind pyramid construction. We're going past the myths and into the lives of the men and women whose hands, hearts, and minds actually built these wonders. These were not slaves driven by whips, as Hollywood might have us believe. They were skilled workers, farmers during the off-season, builders, engineers, and organizers, real people with families, hopes, and incredible resilience. They left behind marks, their tools, their tombs, even their own words written in pottery and stone, and their story is one of the most undervalued chapters in human history. This is a journey into the heart of ancient Egypt, not through the eyes of pharaohs, but through the calloused hands of the laborers. We'll uncover how they moved multi-ton stones without wheels or iron, how they fed thousands of workers in the middle of a desert, and how they managed one of the most complex construction projects ever attempted, all with simple tools and brilliant ingenuity. You'll come away not just amazed by the pyramids, but by the people behind them. So settle in, we're about to give voice to those whose stories have been silent for millennia. So let's start by dismantling one of the biggest misconceptions in all of history. For too long, the image of a vast army of slaves, toiling under the lash to build a pharaoh's tomb, has been the dominant story. This idea, popularized by Hollywood and even ancient historians like Herodotus, is not just outdated, it's flat-out wrong. The truth, uncovered not by grand theories, but by the meticulous work of archaeologists with their trowels and brushes, is far more compelling. The real breakthrough came from the discovery of a site just south of the Giza Plateau, a place now known as Heit el-Ghurab, or the lost city of the pyramid builders. This wasn't a temporary camp or a prison compound. This was a purpose-built, organized town, an ancient version of a major corporate or government project site. Excavations there have revealed a sophisticated settlement with long, narrow galleries that served as dormitories, large bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread every single day, and even evidence of a bustling harbor complex connected to the Nile by a canal. This was the base of operations, the home away from home for the workforce, and what a workforce it was. The bones found in the nearby cemetery tell a powerful story. Studies of these skeletons reveal healed fractures, set by skilled hands, evidence of a medical care system that wouldn't exist for a disposable slave labor force. These injuries were treated, and these people were allowed to recover. They were valued. We also have administrative records written on flakes of pottery called ostraka that detail the payments made to these workers. They were compensated with rations, bread, beer, fish, and meat. This was a form of currency, a salary for their skilled labor. This was a massive state-sponsored project, the ancient equivalent of a national moonshot program. It required the coordination of thousands of people, not just stone cutters and haulers, but bakers, brewers, fishermen, scribes, accountants, doctors, and managers. These were skilled, proud Egyptians who saw this work as a national duty, a sacred service to their king and their gods. They were the ones who achieved the impossible, and by understanding their world, we start to see the true genius of the pyramids not in the stones themselves, but in the breathtaking human organization that made them possible. So if they weren't slaves, who exactly were these people who showed up for work every day on the Giza Plateau? We need to completely shift our perspective from a single, suffering mass to a highly organized and diverse workforce, a complex society in miniature. This was a project that required a vast array of skills, and the ancient Egyptian state was a master of mobilizing its people through a system known as the corvée. Think of the corvée not as slavery, but as a form of mandatory national service, a tax paid not with grain or gold, but with labor, This was a common practice in many ancient societies. For the Egyptians, the timing was everything. Every year, the Nile River would flood, inundating the farmlands and making them impossible to work for a period of several months. This wasn't a disaster, it was the source of Egypt's fertility, but it also meant that a huge portion of the population, the farmers, were suddenly without their usual work. The state, in its brilliant organizational capacity, channeled this available manpower into massive public works projects. So rather than sitting idle, these farmers would be conscripted for a temporary period to serve on projects like pyramid construction, canal digging, or temple building. They were essentially working for their government, contributing to a national monument that had deep religious and political significance, all while being housed and fed. But the workforce was far more than just seasonal farmers. This was the backbone, the muscle, but the project required a permanent core of highly specialized professionals. The real stars of the show were the skilled artisans. These were the elite workers, the master craftsmen whose expertise made the impossible precision of the pyramids a reality. Among them were the stonecutters, the individuals who could precisely shape massive blocks of limestone and granite using nothing more than dolerite hammers and copper chisels. Their work required an incredible eye for detail and an intimate understanding of stone. Then there were the masons, the experts in placing and aligning these multi-ton blocks with astonishing accuracy. We're talking about joints between stones so tight you can't fit a piece of paper between them, a level of precision that still baffles engineers today. The carpenters were equally vital, crafting the sophisticated tools, the massive wooden sledges used for transporting stones, and the intricate framework for the ramps and internal structures. This was a society operating at the very cutting edge of Bronze Age technology, and we cannot forget the immense support staff that kept this entire operation running. This included the boatmen who transported materials on the Nile, the potters who made the vessels for food and water, the metal workers who sharpened and repaired tools, and the scribes who managed the dizzying logistics, tracking everything from workforce numbers to ration distributions. It was a well-oiled machine, a testament to human cooperation and administrative genius on a scale that is almost difficult to comprehend. These people weren't anonymous drones, they were a cross-section of Egyptian society, each playing their part in a grand, collective endeavor that they believed would echo through eternity. To truly grasp the scale of this undertaking, we need to understand the engine that made it all possible, the corvée labor system. This wasn't a brutal mechanism of oppression, it was the sophisticated socio-economic framework of the ancient Egyptian state, a form of national service that functioned like a tax paid with labor instead of money. For the average Egyptian farmer, life was governed by the relentless, predictable cycle of the Nile. The annual inundation was a blessing that deposited rich, fertile silt across the farmland, but it also meant that for roughly 3 months out of the year, the fields were underwater and impossible to work. This created a natural off-season where a massive portion of the population was available for other tasks. The state, in its remarkable foresight, mobilized this available manpower for colossal public works projects. Imagine being conscripted for a rotational stint, perhaps a few months at a time, to contribute to building a monument for your king and your gods. This service was considered a civic duty, a way to contribute to the glory and stability of the nation. It was an obligation, yes, but one that came with significant benefits and a sense of shared purpose. Workers were recruited from villages all across Egypt, creating a melting pot of cultures and skills within the worker settlements. This wasn't just about getting a job done, it was a powerful tool for national unity, bringing people from different regions together for a common, sacred goal. Crucially, the state provided for its workers. This was not a situation where people were expected to fend for themselves. The archaeological evidence from the worker settlements at Giza paints a picture of remarkable provisioning. They were housed in clean, organized dormitories. They were fed a diet that was arguably better than what they had access to in their home villages. The massive, industrial-scale bakeries and breweries produced thousands of loaves of bread and jugs of beer daily. These were not luxuries but caloric staples, the very foundation of the ancient Egyptian diet. They also received regular rations of fish, meat, and vegetables. While they weren't paid in coin money, which didn't exist at the time, this system of rations was a form of payment, a barter-based salary. Some administrative records even indicate that crews would work in a kind of competitive system, with bonuses or extra rations for a particularly productive team. This fostered a sense of pride and camaraderie, not bitter resentment. Participating in the pyramid's construction was likely a point of prestige, a story a worker could tell for the rest of his life. It was a temporary service that offered food, shelter, community, and the honor of contributing to something eternal, making it a vastly different experience from the grim reality of chattel slavery. This organized community reveals a society that deeply valued its workforce. The centerpiece of this city was the gallery complexes, long narrow buildings that served as dormitories. These weren't crude hovels, but structured accommodations with columns running down the center and sleeping platforms built along the walls. Each gallery could house around 40 to 50 workers, likely arranged by their specific trade or the crew they belonged to. This setup wasn't just about efficiency, it fostered a powerful sense of team identity and camaraderie. Crews even gave themselves proud names like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkora, which we know from inscriptions found at the site. These names, painted on storage jars and written on pottery shards, give us a glimpse of their personalities and group pride, something you would never find in a slave camp. The true testament to how well these builders were treated lies in the evidence of their daily sustenance. The scale of food production discovered at Heit el-Ghurab is nothing short of industrial. Archaeologists have uncovered massive bakeries with rows of large clay pots set into mud benches. These were not simple ovens for a family's bread, they were production lines. Estimates suggest that just one of these bakeries could produce enough bread to feed thousands of workers every single day. Right next to these bakeries were equally large breweries. In ancient Egypt, beer was not merely an alcoholic beverage. It was a nutritious, calorie-rich staple, thick and porridge-like, providing essential vitamins and energy for the grueling physical labor. But the most surprising evidence of their high standard of living came from the analysis of animal bones found in the garbage heaps across the village. The sheer volume of cattle, sheep, and goat bones is staggering. The meat from these animals was not a rare luxury reserved for overseers and officials. Butchery marks show that prime cuts of beef and mutton were being consumed regularly by the common workers. This indicates a diet incredibly high in protein, specifically designed to fuel and repair bodies engaged in the most physically demanding work imaginable. These were not people surviving on meager scraps. They were being powerfully fed to maintain their strength and health, treated as the valuable national assets they truly were. Further proof of their valued status comes from the discovery of medical facilities within the village. The remains of what appear to be infirmaries have been identified, and more importantly, the skeletal evidence from the worker cemeteries provides undeniable proof of advanced medical care. Archaeologists have found numerous skeletons with healed fractures. These bones show clear signs of having been expertly set and splinted, allowing the individual to make a full recovery. A broken arm or leg was not a death sentence or a reason to be cast aside. These workers received high-quality treatment and were given the time they needed to heal before returning to their duties. This level of communal care and investment is the strongest possible argument against the slave narrative. You do not provide sophisticated medical treatment to a disposable labor force. You only provide it to people you need, respect, and value. Now, let's step into one of those massive bakeries, a place that was absolutely central to the entire operation. Think of the most immense kitchen you can possibly imagine, a factory of food designed for sheer output. Archaeologists have uncovered these structures, and they are a marvel of ancient industrial engineering. They weren't just a few ovens in a corner. They were long buildings filled with rows of large, conical clay pots, each one nearly as tall as a person. These pots were set into specially constructed mud brick benches, with openings at the bottom to feed the fire. This design created a highly efficient, continuous baking process. The scale is almost beyond belief. Based on the size and number of these installations, experts estimate that a single bakery complex could produce many thousands of loaves of bread every single day. The process was a well-choreographed dance. Workers would mix flour ground from emmer wheat or barley with water and yeast in large vats. The dough would then be shaped into the standard conical or round loaves of the time. These loaves weren't placed directly into the hot clay pots. Instead, the pre-fired pots were heated from the outside, creating a consistent, enveloping heat that baked the bread evenly. The result was a nutritious, calorie-dense staple that formed the core of every worker's ration, providing the complex carbohydrates needed for endless hours of hard labor. Right alongside these bakeries, and often integrated with them, were the breweries. It's crucial to understand ancient Egyptian beer, known as Heit or tenamu, was nothing like the clear, carbonated beverage we think of today. It was a thick, porridge-like nutritious drink, slightly alcoholic, and packed with calories and vitamins. It was a fundamental part of the daily diet for everyone, from pharaohs to laborers, and it was actually much safer to drink than water from the Nile, which could be contaminated. The brewing process was intrinsically linked to baking. Partially baked barley bread would be crumbled into vats of water and left to ferment, creating a nutritious, slightly fizzy concoction that was consumed through a sieve to strain out the husk. The logistical planning behind this food production is a staggering achievement in itself. Someone, a team of ancient administrators, had to calculate the exact tonnage of grain required to feed this temporary city. They had to organize the fleets of barges to transport it from estates across Egypt, store it in granaries, and then oversee its daily distribution to the bakers and brewers. This wasn't a haphazard operation. It was a precision-calibrated system designed to keep the human machine running at peak efficiency. The entire project relied not just on the strength of the workers, but on the genius of the supply chain that kept them strong. All of this incredible organization, the feeding of thousands, the housing, the medical care, and the movement of millions of stones, points to one undeniable fact: there was a brilliant, layered management structure in place. This brings us to the true masterminds behind the daily operations, the ancient world's equivalent of project managers and engineers. These were the overseers and administrators, the highly educated scribes and officials who transformed a pharaoh's divine vision into a precise, executable plan. These men were the elite, the ones who could read and write, a skill so powerful and rare it was considered magical. Their tool was not a hammer or a chisel, but the reed brush and papyrus. They were the accountants, the logisticians, and the HR managers of their day. They kept meticulous records of everything: the number of workmen in a crew, the quantity of tools issued, the amount of stone delivered from a specific quarry, and most importantly, the distribution of those vast food rations. Every loaf of bread, every jug of beer, every cut of meat was accounted for. These records, often hastily scratched onto flakes of limestone or broken pottery called ostraka, were the database that ran the entire operation. Without this army of administrators, the project would have descended into chaos within a week. But perhaps the most humanizing and fascinating evidence of this management system comes from the marks the workers themselves left behind. As the massive stone blocks were hauled into place, the work gangs would often paint or scratch identifying marks onto them. This wasn't just random graffiti, it was a way for a crew to sign their work, to take ownership and pride in their contribution. And the names they chose for themselves are utterly revealing. We have found blocks labeled by gangs with names like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkora. Think about that for a moment. A group of men who proudly called themselves the drunkards of their king. This is not the sentiment of a broken, enslaved people living in terror. This is the boisterous, team-building humor of a skilled crew, a sign of camaraderie, and even a healthy disrespect for absolute authority. These names speak of team spirit, competition, and a shared identity. They were likely organized into smaller groups or files, a system that fostered rivalry and efficiency. You can easily imagine the Friends of Khufu crew ribbing the Drunkards of Menkora about their name, each team striving to move more stones than the other, perhaps for an extra ration of that strong Egyptian beer. This graffiti doesn't just tell us that the pyramids were built by Egyptians. it tells us they were built by people proud, organized, and human in every way. While the bakers and brewers fueled the operation, and the scribes managed its dizzying complexity, none of it would have been possible without the very first link in this monumental chain, the quarrymen. These were the specialists who literally carved the dream out of the living earth, extracting the core building blocks from which the pyramid would rise. Their work was not about brute force. It was a patient, skillful application of simple physics, a testament to a deep understanding of the materials they worked with. The primary source for the Great Pyramid's vast bulk was the Makatem Formation, a layer of nummulitic limestone found in quarries right on the Giza Plateau itself. Imagine the scene, not a quiet, empty desert, but a sprawling, bustling open-pit mine, alive with the rhythmic sound of countless hammers. The proximity of this quarry was a logistical masterstroke. By sourcing the majority of the stone right next to the construction site, the ancient engineers eliminated the single biggest transportation challenge. But extracting these multi-ton blocks from the bedrock was a painstaking art. The quarrymen's primary technique was deceptively simple yet brilliant. They would begin by using harder stone tools like dolerite balls or hammers to pound and smooth the top surface of the bedrock, creating a perfectly flat working area. Then, teams of workers would use copper chisels, the hardest metal available to them, to carefully channel out trenches around the block they intended to free. This isolated the block on all four sides, leaving it still attached to the bedrock at its base. The final and most ingenious step involved a clever trick with wood and water. Along the top surface of the isolated block, workers would drill a series of holes, carefully spaced, using a bow-driven drill with a hard stone bit. Into these holes, they would drive dry wooden wedges. Then, the crucial moment, they would pour water over these wedges. The dry wood would greedily absorb the water, causing it to expand with tremendous, irresistible force. This expansion would create a clean, controlled fracture along the base of the block, perfectly separating it from the bedrock with a loud crack. It was a slow, methodical process, but it allowed them to produce remarkably consistent and precisely shaped blocks, one after another, for decades. For the most prestigious parts of the pyramid, like the burial chamber and the soaring capstone, a different stone was required: the beautiful, intensely hard red granite from quarries over 500 miles to the south in Aswan. Working this stone was an entirely different order of difficulty. Granite is far tougher than limestone, resisting copper tools with ease. Here, the quarrymen employed a more aggressive, percussive method. They would use heavy dolerite pounders, essentially large hard stone balls, to literally pulverize the granite along a desired line. By repeatedly pounding at the same spot, they would eventually wear a groove deep enough to isolate a block. This was an excruciatingly slow and labor-intensive process, a testament to their sheer determination. The fact that they successfully extracted monolithic beams weighing over 60 tons using this method is one of the most awe-inspiring feats of the entire project. The work of the quarrymen was the essential first act of creation, transforming solid rock into a pharaoh's vision, one meticulously fractured block at a time. Once the quarrymen had skillfully freed these colossal blocks from the earth, an even more daunting challenge began: moving them. We are talking about stones weighing 2.5 tons on average, with some, like the granite monoliths in the king's chamber, weighing over 60 tons. Transporting these behemoths across the desert without the wheel, without iron, and without beasts of burden like horses or oxen seems like an impossible task. Yet, the ancient Egyptians developed a brilliantly simple and effective system that turned this Herculean effort into a manageable, rhythmic process. The primary tool for moving these blocks was not a complex machine, but a robust wooden sledge. Archaeologists have actually found remnants of these sledges, and depictions in tombs show us exactly how they were used. A large, heavy block would be levered up and carefully positioned onto a sledge, which was essentially a flat, reinforced wooden platform with two curved runners on the bottom. Ropes made of papyrus and grass were then lashed around the stone and attached to the sledge to secure it. But a sledge dragging directly on sand would sink and create immense friction, making it nearly impossible to pull. The solution to this problem was both ingenious and elegantly straightforward. The key was to create a prepared pathway that minimized drag. We have compelling evidence from tomb paintings and archaeological experiments that the Egyptians did this by wetting the sand or clay in front of the sled. A famous scene from the tomb of Jehu'totep shows a massive statue being transported on a sledge, with a person standing at the front pouring a liquid onto the ground right in front of the runners. For a long time, it was assumed this was a ceremonial act, perhaps an offering, but modern physics has shown it was likely a critical part of the process. When you add the right amount of water to sand, it creates a capillary bridge between the grains, effectively doubling its stiffness and reducing the sliding friction by up to 50%. The sledge would glide far more easily over this dampened, firm surface than over dry, loose sand. It was a simple trick of physics mastered thousands of years ago. This process would have been a spectacle of coordinated human power. A large team of laborers, organized into rows with ropes over their shoulders, would haul on the tow lines. A designated foreman or overseer might have stood on the sledge itself or alongside it, chanting or beating a drum to keep the pulling rhythm perfectly synchronized. The sheer number of men required was immense. Estimates suggest it could take over 150 men to move a standard 2.5-ton block. The path from the quarry to the growing pyramid would have been a well-trodden, meticulously maintained route, constantly being dampened by a crew with water jars to ensure the sledges could keep moving. For the heaviest stones, especially the granite brought from Aswan, the journey began with a 500-mile trip down the Nile. This is where the Egyptians leveraged their greatest natural asset, the river itself. The granite blocks were loaded onto enormous, purpose-built cargo boats. These were not simple reed vessels, they were colossal wooden ships, some capable of carrying loads of up to 200 tons. We know such large boats existed because the solar barge discovered buried next to the Great Pyramid is a stunning example of their sophisticated shipbuilding. These stone-laden barges would then float north with the current, a relatively effortless leg of the journey compared to what came next. The real logistical masterstroke was timing this entire operation with the annual inundation. When the Nile flooded, it didn't just cover the farmland, it sent fingers of water deep into the desert margins, right to the edge of the Giza Plateau. The ancient engineers appear to have excavated a large basin or a series of canals to capture this floodwater and bring it even closer to the construction site. Imagine the scene. As the floodwaters peaked, the heavy barges from Aswan could be floated right through these man-made channels to a harbor complex at the very base of the plateau. This meant the final overland distance these monstrous stones had to be dragged was reduced from miles to a matter of yards. They turned the desert into a temporary port, using the natural cycle of their world as a powerful engine for their ambition. This combination of water and land transport, of simple physics and grand-scale logistics, transformed an impossible task into an achievable one, all through the coordinated effort of countless skilled transporters. With the stones successfully transported to the base of the construction site, the builders now faced their most daunting challenge, defying gravity itself. How do you lift millions of limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, hundreds of feet into the air to form the peak of a 480-foot structure? This is the grand puzzle of pyramid construction, and the answer, almost universally agreed upon by Egyptologists, involves some form of ramp system. But the devil is in the details, and the exact nature of these ramps remains one of Egyptology's most heated and fascinating debates. The most straightforward idea is the linear ramp, a single massive causeway built straight out from one face of the pyramid and gradually extended upward as the structure grew. This theory is intuitively simple and has the advantage of being something we know the Egyptians definitely built, as causeways connecting valley temples to pyramid temples are common features at Giza and other sites. The problem with a single straight ramp for the entire construction, however, is one of sheer volume and impracticality. To maintain a usable gradient for teams of men hauling a multi-ton block, a ramp reaching the top of the Great Pyramid would have had to be over a mile long. The amount of material needed to build such a ramp would have been staggering, nearly equaling the volume of the pyramid itself. Furthermore, as the pyramid rose, this ramp would have completely engulfed the structure, making it impossible to check the all-important accuracy and alignment of the sides. For these reasons, most scholars believe a single straight ramp was likely only used for the initial, lower stages of construction. A more plausible variation is the zigzagging ramp. This theory proposes a single ramp that was not built straight on, but instead ran back and forth along one face of the pyramid, switching directions at the corners. This design would be far more efficient in terms of material, as it would be much shorter than a straight ramp reaching the same height. It would also leave more of the pyramid's faces exposed for surveying. The major drawback of the zigzag ramp is the maneuvering challenge it presents. Imagine trying to carefully pivot a 2.5-ton block of stone on a wooden sledge around a 90-degree corner on a steep incline hundreds of feet in the air. It seems like a precarious and incredibly difficult operation, raising serious questions about its practicality for the thousands of blocks needed for the upper courses. Perhaps the most compelling and widely discussed theory in recent years is the internal spiral ramp. Proposed by the French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin, this model suggests that the main ramp was not an external monstrosity, but a corridor built inside the pyramid structure itself, spiraling upward just behind the outer casing stones. This solves nearly all the problems of the other theories. It requires a fraction of the material, as it uses the pyramid's own core for support. It leaves all four faces completely clear and accessible for the constant surveying and precise placement of the casing stone. And it eliminates the dangerous need for tight cornering on an external ramp. Houdin further supports his theory with modern technologies, pointing to microgravimetry surveys that have detected less dense, potentially ramp-like structures within the pyramid's core. While not yet conclusively proven, the internal spiral ramp theory is currently one of the most elegant and logically satisfying solutions to the vertical challenge. It is highly probable that the ancient engineers did not rely on a single method, but employed a hybrid approach, using different types of ramps for different phases of construction. A massive straight ramp made of mud brick and limestone chippings could have been used for the first third of the build, which accounts for over half of the pyramid's total volume. Then, as the structure narrowed toward the apex, a more efficient spiral ramp, either internal or supported against the pyramid's sides, could have taken over for the precision work of the upper levels. This combination of brute force for the foundation and sophisticated finesse for the peak showcases the adaptive genius of the ancient project managers, who were always ready to evolve their techniques to solve the next impossible problem. While the ramp debate captures our imagination, the true, quiet miracle of the pyramid was happening at the business end of a copper chisel. All the logistics, all the hauling, would have been for nothing without the master craftsmen who transformed rough-hewn stone into precision building blocks. These were the stonemasons, the elite artisans whose skill and patience achieved a level of accuracy that still defies easy explanation. Their toolkit was shockingly simple by our standards, yet in their hands it was more than enough. For the vast majority of the limestone blocks, their primary tools were copper chisels and stone hammers. Copper is a soft metal, and it would have dulled quickly against the abrasive limestone, meaning these masons weren't just artists, they were also full-time tool sharpeners, constantly maintaining their equipment to keep the edges keen. To shape a block, they would use the stone hammers for the initial rough work, knocking off large protrusions. Then, they would switch to the copper chisels for the fine dressing, patiently pecking away at the surface to achieve an astonishingly flat face. The proof of their mastery is in the monument itself. While the core blocks hidden inside the pyramid are rougher, the outer casing stones, most of which are now gone, and the blocks used in the internal chambers were finished to an almost machine-like precision. The joints between these stones are so incredibly tight that you cannot slide a piece of paper, or even a razor blade, between them. This isn't just about making things look pretty. This precision engineering was fundamental to the pyramid's legendary stability. The immense weight of the structure is distributed evenly across these perfectly matched surfaces, preventing points of high pressure that could cause the stone to crack or shift over millennia. Each block literally supports its neighbor, locked together in a monolithic embrace. But the mason's work was only half the story. Once a perfectly shaped block arrived at its destined location, it was the turn of another group of specialists, the setters. These men were the final arbiters of accuracy, responsible for placing each multi-ton block into its exact position with unwavering precision. Their role combined brute strength with the delicate touch of a surgeon. Using levers made of wood and possibly stone, they would nudge the heavy blocks into their final position on a bed of wet mortar. This mortar wasn't primarily for adhesion, as in modern bricklaying. It served as a fine lubricant and leveling agent. As the setters worked the block into place, the thin mortar slurry would squeeze out, allowing them to achieve a perfectly level seat. The culmination of all this painstaking effort is the pyramid's most breathtaking feat of engineering, its near-perfect alignment with the cardinal directions. The base of the Great Pyramid is almost a perfect square, with its sides oriented almost exactly true north, south, east, and west. The error is minuscule, less than 1/15th of a single degree. How did they achieve this without magnetic compasses, which wouldn't be invented for another 2,000 years, or modern laser theodolites? The prevailing theory points to the stars. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous astronomers, and it's believed the surveyors used two primary methods. One method likely involved tracking the movements of a single star. By marking the rising and setting positions of a circumpolar star like Kocheb in the Little Dipper over the course of a night, they could bisect the angle to find true north. Another, simpler method could have used a vertical rod known as a gnomon. By tracking the shadow cast by the sun throughout the day, they could mark the points where the shadow was at its shortest, which defines a true north-south line. This celestial surveying would have been done on a massive, carefully prepared plateau that was leveled to within inches across its entire vast area. The work of the masons and setters was the physical execution of this astronomical vision, translating a heavenly alignment into millions of tons of stone with a degree of accuracy that remains one of humanity's most stunning technical achievements. This brings us to one of the most persistent and fascinating puzzles of pyramid construction, the conundrum of the tools. We've established that the primary metal available to the ancient Egyptians was copper, a material far softer than the incredibly hard stones they were tasked with shaping, particularly the red granite from Aswan and the black diorite used for statues and sarcophagi. A simple copper chisel would be utterly useless against granite. It would bend, dull, and shatter long before it made a meaningful dent. So how did they manage it? The answer reveals not a mysterious lost technology, but a brilliant understanding of material science and a breathtaking amount of patience. They mastered the art of using a hard substance to cut a harder one, employing abrasives to do the real work. The key ingredient in this process was sand, but not just any sand. They specifically sought out sands rich in quartz crystals, a mineral that ranks a 7 on the Mohs scale of hardness, significantly harder than copper and even harder than the granite they were cutting. Quartz sand, when combined with a simple mechanical action and a lubricant like water, becomes an incredibly effective cutting agent. This technique transformed their relatively soft copper tools from cutting implements into delivery systems for millions of microscopic, razor-sharp cutting points. For sawing large granite blocks into slabs, the evidence is both physical and artistic. We have surviving examples of saw marks on unfinished stone artifacts and monuments. The process would have involved a crew of workers using a large, straight copper blade, which itself had no serrated teeth. They would set up the block to be cut and create a guiding groove. Then, the team would pull the saw back and forth along this groove, while an assistant constantly fed a slurry of wet quartz sand into the cut. With each pull, the copper blade would press the sharp quartz particles into the granite surface. The quartz would scratch and gouge the stone, while the copper blade, being softer, would itself be worn away. This meant the workers weren't just cutting stone, they were also constantly replenishing their own tool, as the abrasive sand carved a groove that perfectly matched the shape of the ever-wearing copper saw. It was an incredibly slow process, perhaps only a few millimeters of progress per hour, but it was utterly effective, allowing them to slice through the hardest stone with a tool made of soft metal. The same ingenious principle was applied to drilling, and the results are even more impressive. The Egyptians were master drillers, creating near-perfect cylindrical holes in solid granite for everything from attaching door pivots to hollowing out the interiors of stone vessels and sarcophagi. The core samples that have been found, particularly one now in the British Museum known as the granite core from Giza, provide definitive proof of their method. This core shows clear, concentric spiral grooves cut into its surface. These grooves could only have been made by a tube drill, a hollow cylinder, likely made of copper, fixed to a bow that would spin it back and forth. As with the saw, the drill itself did not cut the stone. Workers would load the drilling site with abrasive quartz sand and add water to create a slurry. As the copper tube was spun under pressure, the sand particles embedded themselves into the soft metal edge of the tube. This created a cutting surface that was effectively made of countless microscopic diamond hard point. The tube drill would gradually grind its way down into the granite, with the abrasive slurry doing the actual cutting and the copper tube simply serving as the vehicle to apply pressure and rotation. The spiral grooves on the core sample show the exact feed rate, how far the drill advanced with each rotation, providing a silent record of an ancient worker's steady, patient rhythm. This method was so precise that it could produce cores with a uniformity that rivals modern machining, a testament to a skill honed through generations of practice. It was a triumph of simple physics and relentless perseverance over brute material strength. Beyond the constant, back-breaking labor of moving stone, there was another, equally vital challenge that the ancient project managers had to solve: the simple, elemental need for water. We are talking about a worksite that, at its peak, hosted a temporary city of thousands of people and countless animals in the arid, sun-baked desert of the Giza Plateau. The human body can only survive a few days without water, and the physical exertion of construction would have dramatically increased that need. Providing a reliable, abundant source of fresh water wasn't a luxury. It was the absolute lifeblood of the entire operation, and the solution they engineered was nothing short of revolutionary. The key to unlocking this puzzle, once again, was the Nile, but the river itself is several kilometers east of the pyramid building sites. Hauling all the water needed for drinking, cooking, washing, and making mortar by the bucket load over that distance would have been its own impossible logistical nightmare. Instead, the ancient Egyptians performed a breathtaking feat of hydrological engineering. They didn't go to the water, they brought the water to them. Recent archaeological work, including sediment core samples drilled around the Giza Plateau, has provided compelling evidence for a massive, man-made basin or harbor complex built right at the edge of the desert sand. This wasn't a small duck pond, this was a major port installation, a sprawling artificial lagoon designed to capture the annual floodwaters of the Nile. During the inundation season, the river would spill over its banks, and through a system of canals, remains of which have been identified, the engineers would channel this precious water directly to the base of the plateau. This created a bustling harbor where cargo boats from across Egypt could dock and unload their precious commodities, from Aswan granite to Tura limestone, right at the doorstep of the construction site. But its function was dual purpose. This harbor basin also served as the primary freshwater reservoir for the entire worker community for the rest of the year. The scale of this system reveals a profound understanding of water management. They weren't just digging a big hole and hoping it would fill with rain. They were actively manipulating the landscape on a grand scale to harness a seasonal event for year-round use. This artificial harbor would have held millions of gallons of water. While the water would have been subject to evaporation and would need to be replenished annually, it provided a massive, stable reserve that could be carefully managed and distributed. From this central reservoir, a network of smaller channels and canals would have distributed water throughout the workers' settlement and the active construction zones. We can imagine teams of water carriers with their jars, or perhaps even simple gravitational-fed clay pipes, ensuring a steady supply reached the massive bakeries and breweries, which would have been among the largest consumers. The harbor water would have been used for mixing the vast quantities of mortar needed to bed the stones, for watering the animals that may have been used in secondary tasks, and for basic sanitation, helping to prevent disease in the densely populated worker city. This sophisticated water management system is the final, crucial piece in the puzzle of how such a monumental project was sustained. It wasn't just about brute strength or clever ramps, it was about sustaining life itself in a hostile environment. The ability to guarantee a reliable water source allowed the state to support a non-agricultural population of thousands for decades. It enabled the industrial-scale production of food and drink. It maintained the health and hygiene of the workforce, and it facilitated the very mixing of the materials that hold the pyramid together. This hidden infrastructure, this mastery of the desert's greatest scarcity, is perhaps one of the most brilliant and overlooked achievements of the ancient builders, turning a potential wasteland into a hive of productive, hydrated human activity. Perhaps the most profound and moving testimony to the value of these workers lies not in the tools they used or the food they ate, but in their own bones. The discovery of worker cemeteries adjacent to the Giza Plateau has provided archaeologists with an unparalleled window into their lives, and the story these skeletons tell is one of remarkable care and compassion. These are not the remains of people who were worked to death and discarded. They are the remains of individuals who were injured, sometimes grievously, and were given the time, resources, and sophisticated medical attention needed to heal. The evidence is both startling and deeply human. Archaeologists have uncovered numerous skeletons with fractures that had clearly healed. A broken forearm, for instance, shows the clean, aligned signs of having been expertly set and splinted, allowing the bone to knit back together perfectly. This level of treatment indicates the presence of skilled medical practitioners who understood bone setting techniques, but the care goes far beyond simple breaks. There are cases of successful amputations where a limb was surgically removed, likely due to a crushing injury or severe infection, and the individual not only survived the traumatic procedure, but lived for many years afterward, as shown by the signs of healing and bone remodeling around the site. This is a staggering achievement for ancient medicine, implying knowledge of cauterization or tourniquets to prevent fatal blood loss, as well as post-operative care to prevent infection. Most astonishing of all are the cases of trepanation, a form of ancient brain surgery. This procedure involved carefully drilling or scraping a hole into the skull, and we have evidence that workers underwent this incredibly delicate operation and survived. The motivation might have been to treat a severe head injury, perhaps from a falling rock or a bad blow, to relieve pressure on the brain. The fact that someone attempted this, and that the patient lived through it, speaks to a medical system that was not just about basic first aid, but was pushing the boundaries of what was surgically possible in the ancient world. This was not experimentation on a disposable slave. This was a desperate, high-stakes attempt to save a valued human life. The implications of this medical care are monumental. It represents a significant economic investment by the state. A slave-driven operation would not waste resources on a worker with a broken leg or a crushed arm. That individual would be left to die or be killed, replaced by another body from an endless supply. The ancient Egyptian state, however, made the calculated decision that it was more efficient and valuable to heal a skilled worker than to replace them. They provided food and shelter during their recovery. They had medical experts on hand to treat them, and they valued the accumulated experience and skill of that individual. This system of healthcare reveals a society that understood the long-term value of its human capital. It transforms our image of the pyramid project from a story of relentless, grinding toil into one of a supported, cared-for community where even in the face of incredible danger, there was a system in place to try and bring you home. These skeletons provide a detailed osteological report, a medical chart written in bone that tells us exactly what this work did to the human body. The most common findings are the clear, unmistakable signs of a lifetime of immense physical strain. Severe osteoarthritis is pervasive, particularly in the spines, knees, and shoulders. The vertebrae often show lipping and Schmorl's nodes little pits, where the soft discs between the bones have herniated into the vertebral body itself from the constant pressure of lifting and carrying heavy loads. We see this in the shoulders and elbows of the stone haulers, and in the knees of the quarrymen who spent their days in a squatting position, hammering at the bedrock. These are not the bodies of elderly individuals. These are the bodies of relatively young men, their joints aged decades beyond their years by the relentless demands of their work. The injuries go beyond chronic wear and tear. There are acute trauma cases that tell vivid, and sometimes brutal, stories. Compressed fractures in the spine, likely from a heavy stone shifting or falling. Crush injuries to feet and ankles. Broken ribs and arms. This was dangerous, high-stakes labor where a single misstep could be catastrophic. The physical price of building an eternal monument was paid in torn muscles, shattered bones, and worn-down joint. This evidence confirms the incredible hardship these men endured, the sheer physical toll of moving mountains, one block at a time, yet crucially, this osteological report does not end with the trauma. For almost every severe injury found, the story continues with a chapter on recovery. The broken bones are not jagged and misaligned, left to heal crookedly and cause a lifetime of pain and disability. They are set cleanly and properly. A fractured femur, for instance, shows clear signs of having been immobilized and supported, allowing it to heal straight and strong. This level of successful intervention requires more than just hope. It requires knowledge, skill, and time. It means someone set the bone, someone fashioned a splint, and most importantly, the injured worker was taken off his duties and given the weeks or months of rest necessary for the bone to knit. He was fed and housed during his convalescence. His value was such that the project could spare him for that long. This evidence completely reframes our understanding of their society. A disposable labor force, a population of slaves, is not afforded this level of care. You do not invest resources in healing a broken man you can easily replace. The comprehensive medical treatment evident in these bones proves that these workers were a valued asset. Their skills and experience were worth preserving. The state made a calculated and compassionate investment in their well-being, understanding that a healed worker would return to contribute more than a new, untrained recruit ever could. Their broken bones, carefully mended, are perhaps the most powerful argument against the old slave narrative, silently testifying to a system that, while demanding everything from its people, also offered a remarkable degree of support in return. Coordinating this immense and diverse workforce required a level of organization that rivaled the precision of the pyramid's architecture itself. With thousands of individuals performing specialized tasks, from quarrying and hauling to precise masonry and administrative duties, the entire operation would have descended into chaos without a meticulous and highly structured system of labor management. The key to maintaining this relentless productivity, while also safeguarding the health and morale of the workers, almost certainly lay in a sophisticated rotation system. Rather than a single, exhausted mass of laborers toiling endlessly, the workforce was likely organized into smaller, specialized units or crews, each with a specific function. We can envision a system where these crews were rotated between different phases of the work. Much like a modern factory assembly line, a team might spend a period engaged in the grueling, percussive work of the quarries, using heavy stone pounders to free blocks from the bedrock. After a set number of weeks, that same crew could be rotated onto transport duty, the slightly different physical demand of hauling sledges across the plateau giving their muscles a reprieve from the constant pounding. Finally, they might be shifted to the construction site itself, learning the skills of levering and setting stones into place under the guidance of master masons. This rotation would have been a brilliant psychological and physiological strategy. It prevented the burnout and overuse injuries that come from performing the same brutal motion day after day, and it introduced variety, breaking the monotony and allowing workers to develop a more well-rounded understanding of the entire project, which likely fostered greater pride and investment in the final outcome. The rhythm of this rotation was almost certainly tied to the natural cycles that governed all of Egyptian life. The 10-day Egyptian week, followed by 2 days of rest, would have provided a natural cadence for scheduling. Crews might have been organized to work in shifts, with some teams active during the cooler morning hours, others taking over in the afternoon, and perhaps even a night shift working by torchlight for tasks that could continue around the clock, like the constant production in the bakeries and breweries or the meticulous sharpening of tool. This staggering of shifts would have ensured that the heartbeat of the construction site never stilled, that the flow of materials from quarry to pyramid was continuous and unimpeded. Orchestrating this ballet of human activity required a command structure with military-like efficiency. At the top were the senior scribes and officials, the project managers who held the grand plan. Below them were the overseers of individual operations, the chief quarryman, the head of transport, the master of works on the pyramid itself. These men would have been responsible for reporting progress, requesting manpower, and ensuring their segment of the operation met its targets. And at the ground level, the work was directed by foremen leading named crews, like the Friends of Khufu. These foremen were the essential linchpins, the non-commissioned officers of the operation. They were the ones synchronizing the pull of 100 men on a rope, maintaining the rhythm with chants or drum beats, and ensuring their team worked cohesively and safely. This clear chain of command allowed for decentralized decision-making. An overseer in the quarry didn't need to consult a top official to solve a local problem, enabling the entire project to adapt and react with agility to daily challenges. This intricate, multi-layered system of rotating, specialized labor, all moving in a coordinated rhythm, was the true engine that powered the pyramid from a pharaoh's dream into stone and mortar, proving that their greatest genius was not just in moving mountains, but in moving the people who moved them. This entire monumental effort, from feeding thousands to moving mountains of stone, was all choreographed to the ancient, unchangeable rhythm of the Nile itself. The Egyptians didn't fight against their environment. They became masters of synchronizing their greatest ambitions with the natural world's most powerful cycles. The entire construction schedule, and indeed the very possibility of such a project, was dictated by the 3 seasons of the Egyptian year: Akhet, the inundation; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. The key to it all was Akhet, the annual flood. For roughly 3 months each year, the Nile would overflow its banks, spreading a layer of rich, fertile silt across the farmland that was the foundation of Egypt's wealth. But this life-giving event also made those very fields a vast, shallow lake, completely impossible to farm. This meant that the country's most abundant resource, its people, was suddenly freed from its primary agricultural duties. The state, in its incredible foresight, saw this not as a period of idleness, but as a window of opportunity. The inundation was the signal to mobilize. This was the time to call upon the corvée labor system, to summon farmers from their villages up and down the river to participate in national service. For a conscripted worker, this was the perfect time to leave home. The farm would take care of itself under the floodwaters, and his labor could be directed toward a project that brought honor and tangible benefits. The strategic genius of this timing extended far beyond just mobilizing manpower. The inundation completely transformed the Egyptian landscape, and the pyramid builders exploited this to its fullest. The floodwaters didn't just cover the fields, they sent channels of water deep into the desert margins, dramatically altering the transportation network. This was the absolute linchpin for moving the heaviest materials. The ancient engineers had prepared for this moment, excavating a massive basin and a series of canals to capture this seasonal abundance and guide it right to the very foot of the Giza Plateau. Imagine the scene as the floodwaters peaked. The colossal cargo barges, laden with 60-ton granite blocks from Aswan, could now sail on a man-made sea. They could be floated directly through these canals to a bustling harbor complex carved into the desert at the base of the construction site. This ingenious system effectively turned the desert into a temporary deep water port for a few critical weeks each year. The most daunting leg of the journey for these monolithic stones, the long, arduous overland haul from the river to the plateau, was reduced from a distance of miles to a matter of a few hundred yards. They used the flood's power to do the heaviest lifting, turning a geographic challenge into their greatest logistical advantage. The rhythm of the Nile didn't just provide the workers, it provided the highway that made the entire endeavor feasible, a brilliant harmony of human ambition and natural power. Keeping this entire operation running for decades required a level of logistical planning that is almost difficult to comprehend. We are talking about managing what was essentially a small, bustling city that materialized in the desert, populated not by permanent residents, but by a rotating workforce of thousands. The challenge went far beyond just moving stones. It was about moving people, and more importantly, moving everything those people needed to survive and work effectively in a demanding environment. This was a colossal exercise in supply chain management, a testament to the overwhelming administrative power and organizational genius of the Old Kingdom state. At the heart of this system was a relentless, clockwork-like supply chain that stretched across the entire length of Egypt. The central administration, operating from the capital at Memphis, would have issued decrees to regional governors, demanding specific resources from their district. This was a form of taxation in kind. A village in the Delta might be tasked with providing a certain quantity of fish, salted and dried for preservation. An estate further south might contribute cattle or goats, driven on the hoof to the plateau. Vineyards would have supplied grapes and dates, while farms provided the immense quantities of emmer wheat and barley that were the caloric foundation of the entire operation. This was a command economy operating at a national scale, all funneling toward one singular, sacred goal. The Nile River was the vital artery that made this all possible. Fleets of cargo boats, working year-round, would have been constantly traveling up and down the river, a watery conveyor belt of supplies. These weren't small reed skiffs. They were large, robust wooden vessels capable of carrying tons of cargo. They would transport grain in sacks, pottery jars filled with honey and oil, and lay animals in pens on deck. The administrative records from the period, written on papyrus and pottery shards, show an almost obsessive level of accounting. Scribes on the docks would meticulously record every shipment that arrived, noting its origin, its contents, and its quantity, ensuring that nothing was lost or misappropriated. This constant flow of goods was the lifeblood of the city, and it had to be perfectly timed to prevent any shortages that could bring the entire project to a grinding halt. Once these supplies reached the harbor at the base of the Giza Plateau, the real work of distribution began. The settlement had to function like a well-oiled machine. The massive, industrial-scale bakeries and breweries we discussed were running 24 hours a day, transforming the delivered grain into the daily bread and beer rations. Butchery areas would have been busy processing cattle and other animals, with the meat likely being salted or smoked to preserve it. The distribution of these rations was a monumental task in itself. Crews were likely organized into work gangs, and each gang would have had a designated representative, a foreman, who would collect the food for his entire team from a central distribution point managed by scribe. This ensured a fair and organized system where every worker received their due, preventing the chaos that would inevitably arise from a free-for-all. Maintaining basic sanitation and order for such a large temporary population was another incredible challenge. The archaeological evidence shows that the worker settlement was surprisingly clean and organized, with designated areas for waste disposal. The sheer volume of organic waste produced by thousands of people eating and drinking daily would have been staggering. This waste had to be systematically collected and disposed of, likely in large pits located away from the living and food preparation areas to prevent disease and vermin. There would have been officials tasked with overseeing this, a kind of ancient sanitation department ensuring that the city did not succumb to its own filth. Furthermore, with so many people from different regions living in close quarters, maintaining social order was paramount. While we have no evidence of a police force, the highly structured nature of the society, with its clear hierarchy of overseers, foremen, and crew leaders, would have provided a natural framework for discipline and conflict resolution. This entire endeavor, from the flow of goods to the flow of waste, stands as one of history's most stunning examples of what humans can achieve through coordinated organization, proving that the true pyramid was not made of stone, but of meticulously managed human cooperation. But beyond the broken bones and the healed fractures, beyond the rations of bread and beer, lies the most profound question of all: what was going on in the minds of these people? Why would anyone willingly subject themselves to such backbreaking, dangerous labor for decades? The answer is not simple, and it cannot be found in a single motivation. It was a complex tapestry of coercion, duty, faith, and a powerful, shared national identity that we, from our modern perspective, can only begin to unravel. We must first acknowledge the element of compulsion. This was not a voluntary job application process. The corvée labor system was a state mandate. a form of taxation that required citizens to contribute their labor. For a farmer from a distant village, receiving the summons to report for national service was not a request, it was an order. There was undoubtedly an element of fear involved: fear of the state's power, fear of the unknown, and fear of punishment for non-compliance. The ancient Egyptian state was a hierarchical, authoritarian structure, and the will of the pharaoh, who was considered a living god, was absolute. To refuse his divine decree would have been unthinkable and would have carried severe consequences, not just for the individual, but potentially for their entire family. So, at its foundation, participation was not a matter of free choice. It was an obligation, a duty imposed from above. However, to view this solely through the lens of coercion is to miss the deeper, more powerful cultural currents that shaped every aspect of an ancient Egyptian's life. For them, this was not just a construction project, it was a sacred act. The pharaoh was not merely a political ruler, he was the intermediary between the gods and humanity. His role was to maintain Ma'at, the fundamental order of the universe, which encompassed truth, justice, and cosmic balance. Chaos and disorder, known as Isfet, were the eternal enemies. The pyramid was far more than a tomb, it was the ultimate engine for ensuring Ma'at. It was a machine designed to facilitate the pharaoh's ascension to the gods and his transformation into an eternal celestial being. By ensuring his successful rebirth and continued reign in the afterlife, the pharaoh would guarantee the Nile would continue to flood, the harvests would be bountiful, and the kingdom would be protected from chaos. Every stone laid was not just for a king, but for the perpetual stability and prosperity of all Egypt. This belief system transforms the work from a chore into a religious duty of the highest order. The worker hauling a stone was not just building a tomb, he was actively participating in a ritual that sustained the very universe. He was ensuring the sun would rise, the river would flood, and his own family back in the village would be safe and fed. This provided a profound sense of purpose that transcended the daily grind. The pride we see in the crew names, the Friends of Khufu, is not the pride of slaves. It is the pride of individuals who believed they were engaged in the most important work imaginable, a direct service to their god-king, and by extension, to their entire nation and its future. This sense of belonging to a grand, national project was likely a powerful unifier. Workers were recruited from villages all across Upper and Lower Egypt. In the worker settlements, a man from the Delta would have labored alongside a man from the southern reaches of the Nile. They would have shared stories, food, and experiences. This melting pot effect would have forged a shared Egyptian identity, breaking down regional differences and creating a powerful sense of collective purpose. They were no longer just men from a single village, they were Egyptians building Egypt. The project became a tool for state building and national unity on an unprecedented scale, creating a population with a shared investment in the success and glory of the central state. And let's not forget the very tangible worldly benefits. For a seasonal farmer, this was a guaranteed job during the off-season. It came with reliable, high-quality rations, more protein and calories than he might have access to at home. It offered a change of pace, a chance to travel, to learn new skills like stoneworking or sailing, and to be part of something historic. There was likely a vibrant social scene within the worker city, with storytelling, music, and the camaraderie of working toward a common goal with your crew. Returning home after your service, you wouldn't just have stories, you'd have the pride of having contributed to a monument that would stand for eternity. Your name, through your crew's graffiti on a stone block hidden within the pyramid, would be there forever. This blend of divine purpose, national pride, and personal benefit created a psychological drive powerful enough to move mountains. It was this belief, this unwavering faith in a collective goal, that truly built the pyramids, stone by hard-won stone. Given the immense scale and inherent dangers of the project, it is only logical to assume that accidents and fatalities occurred. Hauling multi-ton stones, working at great heights, and the sheer physical strain would have inevitably led to injuries that even their advanced medical care could not overcome. The popular imagination, fueled by dramatic stories, often conjures images of countless nameless slaves perishing by the thousands, their bodies unceremoniously dumped inside the pyramid or left in the desert sand. This grim narrative, however, is powerfully contradicted by the physical evidence left behind by the Egyptians themselves, evidence that speaks not of carelessness, but of profound respect. The most telling counter-argument to the myth of mass, anonymous death was the discovery of the workers' cemeteries themselves. These were not hidden pits or secret mass graves. They were purpose-built, formal burial grounds situated on the Giza Plateau, with a clear view of the very monuments these individuals helped to create. The location is deeply significant. In ancient Egyptian belief, being buried in the shadow of a divine pharaoh's tomb and within sight of the sacred structures was a tremendous honor, a privilege reserved for those who were considered integral to the eternal project. It granted them a form of spiritual proximity to the king they served, ensuring their own place in the afterlife. This was not the final resting place of a disposable labor force. It was the honored ground for valued members of the community. The way these individuals were laid to rest removes any remaining doubt about their status. These were not hasty interments. The bodies were carefully placed in simple yet dignified shaft tombs, some topped with mud brick chapels where family members or colleagues could come perform funerary rites and leave offering. But the most moving detail lies within the graves themselves, the presence of grave goods. The ancient Egyptians believed the afterlife was a physical continuation of this one, and you needed your worldly possessions with you. The type and quality of objects buried with a person directly reflected their status and wealth. In the workers' tombs, archaeologists have found pottery jars that once held food and beer for the journey to the afterlife, simple cosmetic items, and the very tools of their trade. A mason might be buried with his favorite copper chisels, a quarryman with his dolerite hammer. These were not lavish, golden treasures fit for a noble, but they were the cherished, essential possessions of a skilled artisan. The inclusion of these items is a silent, powerful testament. It tells us that these men were not stripped of their identity in death. They were buried with the things that define them in life, their skill, their craft, and their pride in their work. Their families, or their crewmates, ensured they were equipped for eternity, a final act of respect and camaraderie. This careful treatment stands in stark opposition to the chaotic picture of countless deaths. The evidence suggests a mortality rate that was likely managed and surprisingly low given the era, not a horrific, continuous carnage. While fatal accidents undoubtedly happened, they were treated as significant events, not routine occurrences. Each loss was acknowledged with proper ritual and burial. The state and the community invested time, resources, and sacred space to ensure these individuals were honored according to their custom. This practice completely shatters the old slave narrative. A society that views its workers as expendable cogs does not build them a permanent cemetery with a view of the king's pyramid. It does not take the time to carefully wrap their bodies and bury them with their personal tools. This level of posthumous care is the ultimate proof that these builders were respected citizens who contributed to a national effort, and in death, they were granted the dignity their service and their humanity deserved. This incredible project was far more than the creation of a single, static monument. It was the nation's most ambitious and demanding training ground. The knowledge accumulated here, the hard-won lessons in engineering, the refined systems of organization, the astronomical precision, and the advanced medical practices did not simply vanish into the desert air once the capstone was set in place. Instead, this vast reservoir of expertise became Egypt's greatest inheritance, a living legacy of skill that was carried away from the Giza Plateau by every worker, scribe, and overseer who returned to their home villages. These individuals became the master teachers for the next generation, ensuring that the specialized knowledge required to build a pyramid became the foundational bedrock for all of Egyptian society's future achievements. Consider the stonemason who spent 2 decades perfecting the art of dressing limestone blocks with nothing but copper chisels and an expert eye. When his service on the royal project ended, he returned to his local community not just as a farmer, but as a master craftsman. He would have been hired to help construct the town's new temple or a noble's tomb, or to train his own sons in these elite techniques. The same precision used to align the king's burial chamber was now applied to building structures that would last for generations in his own community. This dissemination of skill elevated the entire standard of construction across Egypt. The engineering principles learned through trial and error on the ramps of Giza, the understanding of load distribution, leverage, and material strength were now available to every provincial governor planning a new building project, ensuring greater stability and ambition in architecture from the delta to the cataracts of the Nile. The administrative genius honed by the scribes was perhaps the most transformative legacy of all. The men who managed the dizzying logistics of feeding 10,000 people, of tracking thousands of tons of stone, and of rotating a massive workforce became the backbone of the Egyptian state's bureaucracy for centuries to come. They developed systems of accounting, inventory, and resource management that were then applied to governing the entire country. The same meticulous record-keeping used to account for loaves of bread was used to manage the nation's grain reserves, tax collection, and census data. This created a stability and efficiency in governance that allowed the Egyptian state to flourish long after the age of pyramid building had passed. The Pyramid Project was the crucible that forged a professional, highly skilled class of administrators who understood how to run a complex society, making Egypt one of the most effectively managed civilizations of the ancient world. Even the medical knowledge gained from treating the workforce propagated throughout the land. The doctors who learned to set compound fractures, perform amputations, and even attempt brain surgery on the plateau took those skills back to their local clinics. The public health measures developed to maintain sanitation in a crowded workers' city informed how larger towns managed waste and water supply. This collective elevation in medical and practical care would have gradually improved the overall health and lifespan of the population, contributing to the nation's stability and productivity. The pyramid, in a very real sense, helped heal Egypt for generations. The project was not an isolated event that consumed resources and lives. It was a massive investment in human capital that paid continuous dividends, creating a society richer in knowledge, skill, and organizational ability than it had ever been before. The true monument was not the pile of stone, but the enduring civilization it helped to build. But could these methods, so elegant in theory, actually work in practice on the scale required for the Great Pyramid? This is where modern archaeology moves from the dig site to the experimental field, putting these ancient techniques to the ultimate test. One of the most ambitious and illuminating of these efforts was led by Egyptologist Mark Lehner and a team of skilled masons in the 1990s. Their goal was deceptively simple: to construct a small-scale pyramid just under 20 feet tall, using only the tools and methods available to the ancient Egyptians. This wasn't about replicating the monument's grandeur. It was about understanding the process, the physics, and the sheer human effort involved in every single step. The project began where the ancient builders did, in the quarry. The team quickly discovered that the seemingly primitive tools were far more effective than anyone had assumed. Using dolerite pounders, they found they could fracture the limestone bedrock with a satisfying crack, freeing blocks in a matter of hours rather than days. The real revelation, however, came when they tried to move their relatively small, 1-ton blocks. They built a wooden sledge and placed their block atop it, but when they began to pull, the runners immediately dug into the sand, creating a wall of resistance that made progress nearly impossible. It was a moment of profound frustration that suddenly clarified a 2,000-year-old tomb painting. Remembering the depiction of a man pouring liquid in front of a sledge, they decided to try the ancient method. They dampened the sand just in front of the sledge's path. The effect was instantaneous and transformative. The wet sand did not act like mud. It became firm and compact, providing a hard, slick surface for the wooden runners to glide across. The friction was reduced so dramatically that a team of a dozen people could now easily pull the 1-ton block. This simple experiment transformed a curious artistic detail into a validated, brilliant engineering solution, proving that the ancient Egyptians possessed a deep, practical understanding of material science that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. Yet, the most significant takeaway from Lehner's experiment wasn't the success of any single technique. It was the staggering revelation of scale. His team was a small group of dedicated experts, and they were building a pyramid a fraction of the size of the real thing. Even at this diminished scale, the project required immense coordination, patience, and time. Extrapolating that effort to the Great Pyramid, which contains over 2,300,000 blocks, each one significantly larger than their test block, makes the mind reel. It underscores a truth that is often lost in the mystery. The pyramids are not a testament to a secret, lost technology, but to the breathtaking power of sustained, coordinated human effort over decades. This experimental evidence delivers a final, decisive blow to the persistent myths of alien intervention or lost supercivilizations. These theories often hinge on the idea that the work was too quick, too easy, or too impossible for humans alone. But Lehner's project demonstrated the exact opposite. The techniques work, and they work exactly as the archaeological evidence suggests they should. The true magic wasn't in a hidden power source or anti-gravity device. It was in the organizational genius that could feed, house, and motivate thousands of people to apply these simple, effective techniques in perfect harmony day after day for a generation. The experiment didn't uncover a shortcut. It revealed the long, hard, achievable road, paved with human ingenuity and perseverance. So where did this powerful, enduring image of whip-driven slaves actually come from if the evidence so clearly points in another direction? The origins of this myth are almost as old as the pyramids themselves, and they begin with a famous tourist. The Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BC, more than 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was built. He was a brilliant storyteller and is often called the father of history, but he was also a foreigner relying on translators and guides who were centuries removed from the actual construction. The Egypt he saw was under Persian rule, a very different society from the Old Kingdom. It's from his writings, specifically his book The Histories, that we get one of the first and most influential accounts of pyramid building, and he got it spectacularly wrong. Herodotus reported that Pharaoh Khufu was a cruel and oppressive tyrant who closed all the temples and forced the entire Egyptian population into brutal slavery to build his tomb. He describes a system where 100,000 men worked in 3-month shifts, toiling for 20 years to complete the task. While his numbers might be in the ballpark for the total workforce over time, his characterization of their status is where the story veers into fiction. He interpreted the well-organized corvée labor system through his own Greek cultural lens, seeing not a rotating civic duty but abject slavery. His account, filled with drama and moral judgment against a despot, was a sensational story that captured the imagination of the classical world and became a primary source for Western historians for centuries. The irony is that Herodotus, while striving to document history, ended up creating one of its most persistent myths. This narrative was then powerfully reinforced by another ancient text, the Bible. The book of Exodus tells the story of the Israelites enslaved in Egypt, building the store cities of Pithom and Ramses for a pharaoh who knew not Joseph. While the historical evidence for a large-scale Israelite presence in Egypt is slim to none, and the pyramids were already ancient history by the time of the suggested Exodus timeline, the cultural impact of this story is immeasurable. For centuries, Western audiences, whose primary frame of reference for ancient Egypt was the Bible, simply merged the two ideas. The pyramids, as the most obvious and impressive Egyptian structures, became visually synonymous with biblical slavery in the popular imagination. This potent combination of Herodotus's historical account and the Bible's religious authority created a seemingly unshakable foundation for the slave narrative, one that would be incredibly difficult to dislodge. Then came Hollywood. When the motion picture industry began crafting epic spectacles, ancient Egypt was a natural setting for drama, grandeur, and sweeping narratives. Filmmakers like Cecil B. DeMille weren't interested in archaeological nuance. They were interested in compelling stories with clear heroes and villains. His 1956 film, The Ten Commandments, delivered this in spades, presenting a vivid, technicolor vision of Hebrew slaves groaning under the whips of Egyptian taskmasters to build the pyramids and other monuments. This iconic imagery, seen by millions, seared the slave narrative into the modern consciousness far more effectively than any history textbook ever could. It provided a simple, emotionally charged visual shorthand for ancient Egypt: oppressive pharaohs, cruel masters, and suffering slaves. This cinematic trope proved too powerful to resist, being recycled and referenced for decades. Even a century later, big-budget productions often default to this familiar imagery because it creates instant dramatic stakes. It's a classic, easily understood conflict. The problem is that this powerful visual language actively works against the more complex, and ultimately more human, truth. The reality of a well-fed, skilled, and proud workforce doesn't have the same immediate cinematic tension as the struggle for freedom against oppression. So the myth persists because it tells a better story, at least from a screenwriter's perspective. Beyond drama, the slave myth also persists because it serves a psychological purpose. For a long time, the sheer scale and precision of the pyramids seemed to defy logical explanation for the Western world. The idea that such primitive people without advanced technology could achieve such a feat created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve. It was easier to explain it away through the lens of extreme, brutal coercion, to attribute the achievement to a terrifying, alienating force, rather than to acknowledge a highly sophisticated and organized society that rivaled our own in many ways. The slave narrative, in a strange way, protected a Eurocentric view of historical progress by framing this incredible achievement as an anomaly born of cruelty, not a testament to the universal genius of human collaboration. Accepting the truth means accepting that an ancient civilization possessed a kind of logistical and social intelligence that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate, and that is a truly humbling, and for some, a deeply challenging, idea to embrace. So let's bring this all together. The story of the pyramids isn't a mystery to be solved by alien intervention or lost technologies. It is, instead, one of the most powerful and well-documented stories of human achievement in our entire history. The evidence is overwhelming, and it all points in the same direction. This was the work of a paid, skilled, and highly organized workforce, not a mass of enslaved people. It was made possible by a sophisticated system of state support that provided food, shelter, and even advanced medical care. The real wonder isn't in the stones themselves, but in the breathtaking logistics, the bakeries that produced thousands of loaves, the harbor that captured the Nile's floodwaters, the administrators who tracked every ration and every block. When we look at the Great Pyramid, we should no longer see a silent, mysterious tomb. We should see the culmination of that effort. We should see the quarries buzzing with activity, the sledges gliding over dampened sand, the masons carefully dressing each block, and the setters levering them into perfect alignment. We should hear the rhythmic chant of a hauling team and smell the bread baking in those massive ovens. This monument is a testament to what humans can accomplish when we cooperate on a grand scale, when we apply ingenuity to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and when we persevere together toward a shared goal for generations. The pyramids stand not as a monument to a single pharaoh's ego, but to the collective spirit of an entire civilization. They are a memorial to the farmers, the carpenters, the scribes, the doctors, the cooks, and the countless nameless individuals who contributed their strength and their skill to an idea that outlasted them all. They remind us that our greatest achievements are always, fundamentally, human achievements. So the next time you see a picture of the Great Pyramid, remember the people behind it. Their story is the true wonder. We would love to hear which part of their incredible story amazed you the most. Was it the advanced medical care, the sheer scale of the logistics, or the ingenious trick of wetting the sand? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.